Welcome to your deep dive. We have a really powerful set of sources today, and they're focused on, well, what feels like a truly revolutionary new framework for sustainability.
That's a good way to put it. It's revolutionary because it asks us to think beyond, the usual boxes, beyond nation states, and definitely beyond those short-term political games we see so often.
It's exactly. Those cycles can be so frustrating. So today we're diving into what these sources call the Sustainable Regionalization Goals, or SRGs for short.
And our mission here is really to analyze the kind of the architecture of this whole system. We're focusing specifically on something called Meta-SRG1.
Meta-SRG1. Okay, what is that exactly?
Think of it as the institutional and ethical operating system for the entire structure. Its title is Relational Governance and Ethical Systems. It's the foundation everything else is built on.
Okay, so if Meta-SRG1 is the operating system, then the 6 core goals underneath it are like the essential apps, the programs that make it all run.
That's a great analogy, actually. Yes. And we're going to try and unpack each one. There's just and relational governance, that's SRG1. Then regenerative and equitable governance, SRG2.
Okay.
Then SRG3 is multi-scalar eco-social cohesion. SRG4, multi-temporal governance, thinking about time differently.
Right.
SRG5 is deep memory governance, bringing in history and culture. And finally, SRG6, transversal partnerships for the goals, which is all about connection.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot. It sounds incredibly interconnected, dense.
It is dense, but the core insight, the thing driving all this material, it comes down to a surprisingly simple, elegant question. It really challenges our basic political assumptions.
Which is?
If the global scale is so powerful and the local scale is so richly diverse, then who mediates the spaces between?
The space between. And the answer the framework gives is the region.
Region, exactly. But, and this is crucial, we're not talking about the region as just, a fixed boundary on a map, a line someone drew once.
No. How then?
The sources frame the region as a dynamic thing, a socio-ecological cultural interface. It's constantly shifting, a space of negotiation, really, where those big global pressures like economic trends or climate change meet local history, local resources, local culture.
An interface. I like that. So for you, the listener, the key takeaway here isn't just abstract theory, right?
Definitely not. We're going to be looking at specific evidence-backed mechanisms, things drawn from, say, global economic data from places like our world in data, all the way to really sophisticated indigenous co-governance models.
Like the ones used in the Great Barrier Reef.
Precisely. Examples that show how regions can actually achieve this kind of systemic ethical transformation in practice. It's about the how, not just the what's.
Okay, let's get into it. Let's unpack this foundational shift. We're jumping right into section 1, the foundational shift, Meta-SRG1, relational governance and ethical systems. And we have to start with a reality check, don't we?
We do. The sources are very clear on this. You can't build these sophisticated, ethical, sustainable systems if the basic material foundation isn't there. So we start with the necessary material foundation, escaping extractive poverty.
Because historically that was the default, wasn't it? Extreme poverty.
Overwhelmingly so. For almost all of human history, pervasive extreme poverty was the norm. Just getting by was the main focus. So yeah, while we talk about ethics and complex policy, the sources are pretty blunt. Transforming governance fundamentally requires escaping that poverty trap first.
And that escape, it's tied directly to economic growth, sustained growth.
Sustained and ideally inclusive economic growth. That's what provides the material base, the stability needed for everything else.
And the data on this escape, I mean, looking back over the last 50 years or so, it's actually kind of an optimistic story, isn't it? The sources mention global economic convergence.
It's arguably the most optimistic story. Yeah, the data shows global economic inequality measured between countries actually peaked somewhere around the 1970s. And since then, it's been steadily declining.
That's counterintuitive to what you sometimes hear.
It can be. But what's happening is a shift in the global income distribution. Historically, it looked like a camel with 2 humps.
Right.
A smaller hump for the wealthy West, a much bigger hump for the developing world.
Right, the 2-humped distribution.
And we're rapidly moving towards a world with just 1 hump, a single, more cohesive distribution. Not that inequality within countries isn't a huge issue, it is. But this between-country convergence is massive. It provides that stable material base we were talking about.
So what drove that, especially thinking about places like Southeast Asia, where so much of that catch-up growth happened? It wasn't just luck, right?
No, not at all. The sources point towards, well, smart policy choices over decades. It wasn't just about having resources. It was about building institutional stability, having a clear focus on things like export-led growth, but critically,
Critically.
massive, sustained investment in public goods, especially education and basic infrastructure. These regions built up their own sovereign capacity. They moved up the value chain.
From just raw materials to manufacturing services.
Exactly. And that provides that foundation.
Yeah.
When people aren't just focused on surviving until tomorrow, they can start looking beyond. They can demand higher ethical standards from their governments, from their institutions.
Which leads us right to the next point. Growth itself isn't enough. It needs direction, which is the mechanism. Investment in public goods.
Correct. Meta-SRG 1 insists that growth has to be leveraged. If that new wealth just pools at the top or gets siphoned off, it can actually make inequality worse, undermine the whole project.
So governance has a job to do, directing that wealth.
A crucial job, strategically funding those absolutely essential public goods. We kind of take them for granted now, but stable, healthy societies didn't just happen. They required huge public investments in things like sanitation systems,
Clean water.
universal access to clean water,
Yeah.
widespread vaccine programs, robust public education systems. These were foundational.
And the return on that investment is huge, isn't it? The sources link sanitation and education directly to stable societies, better health.
Absolutely enormous returns, especially when you're starting from a low baseline. Investing in basic public health and education. It's exponential. It's what unleashes human potential, human capital.
And it can happen fast.
Surprisingly fast, if the will is there. The sources give examples: China, Rwanda, Vietnam, countries that achieved near universal health coverage in about a decade. A single decade.
Wow.
Yeah. It shows that systemic change, when you have the material growth and the political commitment, can happen much faster than we often assume.
Okay, so that's the material foundation laid out. But then there's the other piece, the ethical foundation, maybe the harder part to really nail down in governance. The ethical foundation, redefining value and oneness.
Yeah, this is where we shift gear a bit. From the purely pragmatic to something more profound, maybe. The framework argues that real ethical grounding needs a fundamental shift in what we value.
A shift away from.
Away from focusing only on extrinsic rewards. Money, power, status, fame, the things that often drive extractive systems where value is just about what you can take out.
And towards what instead?
Towards what the sources call transcendental values, things that are inherently people positive and planet positive. Cooperation, compassion, ecological stewardship, justice.
And there's a warning in the sources about leaders who say one thing but value another, right? About inconsistency.
A very strong warning. It's a critique of governance, where leaders might talk a good game about ethics, but their actions, or the way the system rewards people, still prioritizes those extrinsic motives: personal wealth, power, re-election at any cost.
Because that inconsistency breeds cynicism, undermines trust.
Completely. If a leader's real incentives are tied to wealth or fame, any big attempt at systemic change towards sustainability or justice will likely falter. People see that hypocrisy. The sources insist these values can't just be, nice words on a mission statement. They have to be systemically embedded in how people are recognized, promoted, rewarded. The system itself needs to reward cooperation, maybe even more than just pure competition.
Okay, so if we're moving away from those purely extrinsic, often extractive values, what's the positive principle that should guide this relational governance? You mentioned a principle of oneness.
Yes. The idea is that effective relational governance must actively champion this sense of oneness of human beings. It's a pretty bold claim.
It sounds aspirational, especially when you look around at the world today with so much division and polarization. How does the framework argue this isn't just wishful thinking?
It grounds it philosophically. The sources argue that things like tribalism and polarization, they're actually based on an illusion of separateness, whereas unity, interconnectedness that actually conforms to the deeper reality, ecological reality, economic reality, even our shared humanity.
So the challenge for governance is to make that underlying reality visible, functional.
Exactly, to design institutions and foster cultures that reflect that interconnectedness. And it draws on some ancient wisdom here, specifically Stoic philosophy. It cites Marcus Aurelius.
The Roman emperor.
The very same. His idea that we should see ourselves not just as parts of society, the Greek word is meros, but as members meros.
Part versus member. Meros versus meros. What's the significance of that distinction?
It's huge, institutionally. If you're just a part, like a cog in a machine, you're replaceable, expendable, maybe. Your value is purely instrumental.
But if you're a member?
If you're a member, like a limb of a body, you're integral. Your well-being is intrinsically linked to the health of the whole organism, and the organism's health depends on you. It implies interdependence, mutual responsibility.
And that interdependence forms the basis for relational ethics in practice.
Precisely. Governance stops being just about imposing rules from the top down. It becomes a moral practice, a shared responsibility. And for that to work, you need high levels of social capital, trust.
Which comes back to that twin foundation we talked about, material security and demonstrated ethical behavior from leaders.
Yes, they reinforce each other. And the sources define that ethical behavior partly as the willingness to return kindness, to feel a sense of reciprocal obligation. When people see leaders acting for the collective good, trust builds.
And that trust is like a fortification.
That's the language used, yeah.
Yeah.
The love of his countrymen is described as a fortification that cannot be stormed. Practically speaking, leaders who are transparently working for collective well-being, who build that trust, they can navigate crises much more effectively. If the public just sees self-interest or corruption, the system becomes brittle. It breaks under pressure.
Okay, that gives us a really solid grounding in Meta-SRG 1, the material and ethical foundations. Now let's move into Section 2, SRG 1 and SRG 2. These are the core mandates for governance itself, justice and regeneration, starting with SRG 1, just a relational governance. This is the accountability mandate.
That's right. SRG 1 is about transforming governance from, that static, sometimes coercive, top-down control model into something living, ethical, co-creative. It prioritizes justice and pluralism, recognizing and valuing difference.
And how does it ensure accountability in practice? What's the key mechanism?
The most fundamental mechanism, according to the sources, is putting real constraints on power. They call it the political fail-safe.
The political fail-safe. And the evidence for needing this is stark.
It's chillingly clear, yeah. The sources point to data on catastrophic mass mortality famines, the kind that kill millions. Historically, these have overwhelmingly occurred in autocratic regimes, dictatorships, single-party states.
And they have not occurred.
They have demonstrably not occurred within functioning multi-party democracies.
Yeah.
That correlation is incredibly strong.
Why? What is it about democracy that acts as this fail-safe?
It's about responsiveness and feedback. Democratic political rights, things we sometimes take for granted, like a free press, free and fair elections, the right to criticize the government without fear. These things compel authorities to be responsive.
Because they can be held accountable.
Exactly. If a government knows its failures will be exposed in the media or that it can be voted out of office, it has a powerful incentive not to let a crisis spiral into a catastrophe. They can't just ignore suffering the way an unaccountable autocrat might. It creates vital feedback loops that force action.
But as you said, history isn't a straight line. Progress can be reversed. The framework warns about vigilance against rollback, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The global spread of these political rights over the last century or so is called an astonishing achievement. And it is. But the sources are quick to add that progress is far from inevitable.
We've seen examples of democratic backsliding recently.
We have. Several populous countries have been reclassified from democracies to electoral autocracies, regimes that hold elections but lack the fundamental freedoms and checks on power. It shows how easily these essential rights, this fail-safe, can be eroded.
So adaptive governance, this relational governance, has to constantly defend those rights.
Continuously. Yeah. Especially at the regional and local levels, where accountability can be most direct and immediate. It's an ongoing process, not a one-time achievement.
Now, within this just framework, you're dealing with diverse regions, different cultures, ecosystems, needs. Applying universal laws rigidly can sometimes cause problems, can't it? How does the framework handle integrating equity and law?
This is a really interesting part. It brings back the classical concept of equity, drawing from thinkers like Aristotle. Equity is presented as a necessary correction for law, specifically when the law is defective by reason of its universality.
Defective by universality, meaning law has to be general, but life is specific.
Precisely. Law aims for consistency, applies the same rule to everyone in a category. But sometimes, that generality causes injustice in a specific, unforeseen situation.
Can you give us a practical example in a regional context?
Sure. Imagine a regional government passes a universal law strictly limiting water extraction from all rivers during dry seasons to protect the overall ecosystem. A generally good law. But maybe there's a small, specific indigenous community whose entire cultural practice in subsistence farming relies on taking a very small, traditionally managed amount of water from one particular tributary during that exact season. The universal law, applied blindly, could destroy their way of life, even though their impact is negligible to the overall system.
Ah, I see. The universal rule misses the crucial local context.
Exactly. Equity, in this framework, allows the regional governance system to recognize that specific situation, to make a just exception or adaptation. It sets right omissions the original lawmaker couldn't possibly foresee. It allows for that necessary flexibility to integrate unique ecological realities, cultural needs, ensuring true pluralism, not just formal equality.
So it makes governance less about just applying rules and more about exercising judgment, a moral practice, like you said.
That's the core of SRG1, accountability through rights, flexibility through equity.
Okay, that's SRG1, the accountability mandate. Now let's move to SRG2, regenerative and equitable governance. This is framed as the stewardship mandate. More active, more generative.
Yes, SRG2 is about positioning governance not just as a referee or rule enforcer, but as an active force for positive transformation. It needs to be ecologically aware, culturally rooted, and driving towards genuine equity in knowledge, opportunity, and outcomes.
And that focus on equity, it goes deep, right? Beyond just saying don't discriminate, it's about addressing structural inequality.
It has to. The first step is obviously dismantling explicit legal barriers. Old laws, say, preventing women from certain jobs or owning property. That's the easy part, relatively speaking.
The harder part is the systemic stuff, the invisible barriers.
Exactly. The sources highlight that even in countries with pretty progressive laws on the books, significant gaps remain, like the gender pay gap. And a large part of that remaining gap isn't easily explained by direct discrimination anymore.
So what does explain it?
It's often structural issues. Things like occupational segregation, where societal norms or educational tracking subtly funnel women and men into different types of jobs, with traditionally female jobs often being lower paid. And the other big one is the motherhood penalty.
The motherhood penalty. That's the career disadvantage women often face after having children.
Yes. It's about how workplaces are structured. Often, they disproportionately reward long, inflexible hours, face time, unbroken career trajectories, things that are harder to maintain if you're the primary caregiver. So governance under SRG2 needs to tackle that structure.
How? What kind of policies?
Things like generously compensated parental leave, especially paternal leave to encourage shared caregiving, mandating flexible work options where feasible, investing heavily in high-quality, affordable childcare. These aren't just nice-to-have social policies. The sources frame them as core economic mechanisms for achieving genuine, long-term equity of outcome.
This implies governance can't just accept social norms as they are, it needs to actively try and shape them. Which brings us to normative reform.
This is really powerful insight in the sources. Governance often treats culture and norms as fixed background conditions. But this framework says, no, norms are malleable. They can change, sometimes surprisingly quickly.
Malleable, like how? What evidence is there for that?
There's empirical evidence showing that deeply entrenched norms, things that seemed immutable, like the social acceptability of domestic violence in some places, or strong son preference leading to skewed birth ratios, these can actually shift quite rapidly.
And what drives those shifts? It's not always just laws, is it?
Often not.
Yeah.
One of the fascinating mechanisms highlighted is exposure to alternative lifestyles and perspectives, often through media. Think about the impact of television dramas, soap operas, even social media, showing different ways of living, different family structures, women in non-traditional roles.
So media can act as a catalyst for normative change.
A powerful one. And SRG2 says policy should actively recognize and even leverage this, not in a coercive way necessarily, but by supporting media diversity, educational programming, and cultural initiatives that challenge harmful norms and promote pluralistic values. It's like governance using cultural levers for positive social change.
Okay, shifting to the regenerative part of SRG2, ecological stewardship. How does it mandate regenerating natural capital?
It demands a fundamental shift in perspective. Moving beyond just trying to slow down environmental damage or conserve what's left, the mandate is natural restoration, actively helping nature heal and achieve self-renewal.
So not just protecting national parks, but actively restoring degraded ecosystems.
Yes. Giving restoration a really high priority. This means initiating and funding major projects, things like large-scale reforestation with appropriate native species, not just monoculture plantations, extensive restoration of coastal wetlands, mangroves, salt marshes, which are incredibly important for biodiversity and as buffers against storms and sea level rise.
And soil health, too.
Absolutely. Improving contaminated or degraded soils to boost sustainable agriculture and carbon sequestration.
But restoration projects often run into conflict with other demands, right? Economic development, existing land use. How does SRG2 suggest managing those trade-offs?
It acknowledges the complexity. It's not about stopping development, but guiding it. Part of the strategy is encouraging increased productivity on existing agricultural land through sustainable intensification, but better techniques so that other land can be spared or set aside for nature.
Using land more efficiently to free up space for restoration.
Exactly. And it also means steering consumption patterns away from the most resource-intensive products. Critically, regional governance needs to create the right incentives, making restoration financially viable, maybe through payments for ecosystem services, where landowners are paid for the clean water or carbon storage their restored land provides, or tax breaks for regenerative farming practices.
So it's about changing the economic equation, making regeneration pay.
In essence, yes, shifting from viewing nature purely as a resource to be extracted to seeing it as vital, sovereign capital that needs ongoing investment and regeneration.
That focus on long-term health and investment transitions us perfectly into Section 3, SRG4 and SRG5. This is about the temporal dimension, time, and memory. Let's start with SRG4, Multi-Temporal Governance, and its focus on long-horizon planning.
Right. SRG4 is explicitly designed to counteract that political short-termism we talked about earlier, the obsession with the next election cycle, the next quarterly report.
Instead, it wants governance to engage with time differently.
In a layered way, connecting past, present, and future, making sure policies and institutions function across multiple timescales simultaneously. And the driving force behind this urgency, especially now, is the climate crisis. It demands acceleration.
Acceleration, because past transitions took too long.
Way too long. If you look at history, big energy transitions moving from wood to coal or coal to oil and gas, these unfolded over many decades, sometimes a century or more.
We don't have that kind of time now.
We absolutely do not. To meet climate goals, to decarbonize our energy systems, which is crucial, since fossil fuels account for roughly 75% of greenhouse gas emissions, governance needs to force a change in pace and scale that is genuinely unprecedented in human history.
So how do you institutionalize that? How do you make a 50, 100-year view stick when political incentives are so short-term? The sources give examples, right? Let's start with public health financing.
Yeah, this is a great example of long-term thinking in practice. If you want sustainable public health systems over, say, 50 years, how do you fund them reliably? The key insight from the sources is prioritizing domestically autonomous funding.
Meaning relying less on foreign aid.
Exactly. Relying primarily on domestic resources, usually raised through fair, predictable, and efficient taxation. Because the evidence shows that external aid, while helpful initially, tends to sharply decline as countries achieve slightly higher income levels.
The paradox you mentioned earlier, just when a country might be able to really scale up its health system.
The external support starts to dry up, leaving them vulnerable. So building that robust, sovereign domestic funding base is the only way to guarantee sustainability over that 50, 100-year horizon.
And we saw examples like China, Rwanda, Vietnam achieving near universal coverage quickly. That wasn't just aid, it was national commitment.
It was primarily national commitment and sustained domestic financing. That's institutionalizing the long view in a critical sector.
Okay, what about the private sector? Is corporate foresight adapting to this need for longer time horizons?
Increasingly, yes. It's becoming a necessity, especially for industries with massive, long-term capital investments. The sources mentioned Toyota, for example.
Toyota looking 50 years ahead.
Actively. They have a future production plans project which looks 50 years into the future.
Why?
Think about building a giant new car factory. That's a multi-billion-dollar bet that lasts for decades. You have to try and anticipate energy sources, material availability, climate regulations, consumer demands 30, 40, 50 years out.
It forces long-term thinking.
It does. And it's not just manufacturing. Look at the energy sector itself. Companies like ExxonMobil, the sources say, extend their internal risk analysis, their sensitivity planning for potential policies like carbon taxes, out to 2050.
Because their investments in oil fields or refineries also have lifetimes measured in decades.
Exactly. They have to model these long-term risks. So what was maybe once seen as a niche thing for futurists is becoming mainstream corporate strategy. And regional governance can align its own long-term infrastructure and climate planning with these corporate horizons, creating synergies.
So from planning for the distant future, SRG5 takes us deep into the past. SRG5, deep memory governance. The cultural anchor, what's this about?
This is about reclaiming memory, collective memory, cultural narratives, ancestral wisdom, the significance of place, reclaiming it not just as history, but as a dynamic, active force for shaping the present and future.
So not just nostalgia, but memory as a resource.
a vital resource for forward action. The big challenge, especially for modern pluralistic governance, is how do you formalize this? How do you bring symbolic narratives and traditional knowledge into governance without imposing one single story or freezing culture in time?
Tricky. Does it offer examples?
Yes, the management of Yellowstone National Park, YNP, in the U.S., is presented as an evolving model.
Yellowstone. Iconic wilderness. But its history with indigenous peoples is complicated, isn't it?
Very complicated.
Yeah.
Historically, the park's creation involved the displacement and exclusion of the very people who had lived there for millennia. But the current approach attempts to embody deep memory governance. First, through explicit formal recognition of traditional connections. YMP officially acknowledges 27 associated tribes who have deep ancestral and ongoing connections to the land within the park, stretching back over 11,000 years.
11,000 years.
Yeah. And it's not just a statement. It's linked to institutionalized engagement. They've established things like the Yellowstone Tribal Heritage Center. This provides a dedicated, permanent platform for indigenous artists, scholars, elders, storytellers to directly share their knowledge and perspectives with visitors, with researchers, with park managers themselves.
So it moves beyond just consultation. It's about integrating that deep memory into how the park is actually run.
That's the goal. Valuing that indigenous place-based knowledge built over centuries about wildlife, fire ecology, plants, water, valuing it alongside Western scientific data. It's about achieving a kind of epistemic pluralism.
Epistemic pluralism, valuing different ways of knowing equally.
Right. So that 11,000 years of collective memory can genuinely inform decisions made today about, say, managing bison populations or using controlled burns for forest health.
Now, this deep memory work must also involve confronting past harms, right? Historical injustices, ecological damage. How does SRG-5 approach future-oriented justice?
It argues that accountability is essential, but the spirit of that accountability should be focused on healing, on restoration, and critically, on deterrence preventing future harm. It draws on a philosophical idea that correction and punishment should always look to the future and never to the past. Meaning the primary goal isn't retribution or vengeance for past wrongs, though acknowledgement is vital. The primary goal is to amend the system, to learn the lessons, and to build safeguards so those harms aren't repeated. It operates in a spirit of precaution, focused on the long-term health of the community and the ecosystem for generations to come.
That requires a difficult balance. Acknowledging pain, but channeling it constructively.
A very difficult but necessary balance for long-term reconciliation and resilience.
And to navigate all this complexity, the long time horizons, the deep memory, the ethical balancing acts, leaders and institutions need a particular mindset. The sources call it epistemic humility.
Yes. This is crucial for long-term success. Epistemic humility is basically the institutionalized willingness to admit you might be wrong, to revise your beliefs, your policies, based on new evidence, new facts, different perspectives.
Sounds simple, but probably very hard in practice, especially for powerful institutions or leaders.
Extremely hard, because admitting error can feel like admitting weakness. Leaders often get surrounded by yes men or filter bubbles that reinforce their existing views. This creates organizational blindness, leading to costly and sometimes catastrophic mistakes.
So how do you institutionalize humility?
You build it into the governance structures, mandate processes for structured dissent, create internal red teams whose specific job is to challenge the dominant assumptions, ensure decision-makers are regularly exposed to data and viewpoints that contradict their preferred narrative. It's about building institutional safeguards against hubris and groupthink.
A necessary defense mechanism for complex, long-term governance. Okay. That wraps up time and memory. Let's move to our final section, Section 4, SRG-3 and SRG-6. This is about scale and interconnection, the adaptive architecture needed for regional resilience. Kicking off with SRG-3, Multi-Scalar Eco-Social Cohesion.
Right. If Meta-SRG1 is the foundation and the other SRGs are core functions, SRG3 is kind of the connective tissue. It's all about the dynamic, adaptive integration of everything, different values, worldviews, governance practices across all the relevant scales, local, regional, national, global.
Keeping it all coherent, basically.
Coherent and resilient. And one of the biggest immediate challenges for cohesion in our interconnected world is figuring out how to mitigate global shocks locally.
You mean things like global trade? It creates huge benefits overall, efficiency, lower prices, but the downsides aren't evenly spread.
Exactly. Global interdependence, like free trade agreements, generates massive aggregate gains. But the sources acknowledge it also creates real distributional concerns at the local level. Specific industries decline. Jobs are lost in particular towns or regions. Communities can be destabilized. We see this with deindustrialization.
And if those local shocks aren't managed, it breeds resentment, undermines support for global cooperation.
Precisely. Social cohesion fractures, you get political backlash. So SRG3 argues that adaptive regional governance must have policies in place to manage these local impacts. Things like robust unemployment benefits, effective job retraining programs, targeted investments in affected communities, basically, mechanisms to redistribute some of the overall gains from globalization to those who bear the immediate adjustment costs.
It's like social scaffolding to ensure global integration doesn't break local communities.
That's a good way to think of it. Scaffolding that maintains social trust and stability.
And given that most people now live in urban areas, this multi-scalar challenge is particularly acute in cities, right? Addressing urban equity and trans-scalar issues.
Hugely acute. The scale of urban inequality is just staggering. The sources point out that globally, almost 1 in 4 city dwellers lives in what's classified as a slum household.
1 in 4, lacking basic things like safe water, sanitation, durable housing.
Yes, and this isn't just a city problem, it's inherently multi-scalar. It involves the relationship between the urban core, the expanding peri-urban areas around cities, and the surrounding rural towns and villages.
Because issues like migration, resource flows, infrastructure planning, they all cut across those boundaries.
Completely. You can't fix urban poverty or manage urban sprawl just by focusing within the city limits. Regional governance under SRG3 needs to coordinate planning, resource allocation, and infrastructure development across that entire urban-rural continuum, ensuring that growth is equitable and doesn't just concentrate opportunity in the core while hollowing out the hinterlands.
But how do you coordinate across scales while still respecting local differences and autonomy? That brings us to differentiated regional strategies, avoiding conformity.
This is key to making multi-scalar governance work without breeding resentment. SRG3 explicitly rejects one-size-fits-all policies dictated from a central authority, whether national or even regional.
Because what works in one part of a region might be totally wrong for another.
Exactly. You have to tailor policies to local realities. The sources use the idea of varying carrying capacity, different economic bases, unique ecological challenges, distinct cultural contexts. For example, the regulations and support mechanisms needed for a coastal fishing community dealing with climate change impacts are going to be vastly different from those needed for an inland region focused on high-tech manufacturing or drought-resistant agriculture.
So differentiation fosters resilience by fitting the solution to the specific context.
Yes. It avoids imposing a rigid conformity that might look neat on paper, but fails in practice because it ignores crucial local variations. It's about enabling tailored resilience.
Okay, that leads us to the final goal, the one that ties everything together through collaboration. SRG6, Transversal Partnerships for the Goals. This is the bridging mandate.
It is. Transversality is about intentionally cutting across boundaries, breaking down the traditional silos we operate in between scientific disciplines, between government departments, between academia and industry, between science and culture, between policy and economics, fusing them together for collaborative action.
Sounds good in theory, difficult in practice.
Very. But the sources point to the management framework for the Great Barrier Reef, GBR, in Australia, as a kind of living laboratory for this kind of transversal approach.
The Great Barrier Reef, how does its management go beyond just having different stakeholders talk to each other?
It strives for genuine epistemic integration. That means actively weaving together multiple ways of knowing into a unified adaptive management system. You have cutting-edge marine science on coral bleaching and water quality, sitting alongside the deep, long-term ecological knowledge of the indigenous traditional owners of the sea country.
And economic planning, too, for tourism, fishing.
Yes. And regional development planning. It's about fusing all these perspectives. And crucially, it aims for epistemic justice, treating that indigenous knowledge not just as interesting folklore to be consulted, but as a valid parallel stream of evidence, equal to scientific data, in making critical decisions about reef management, like seasonal closures or identifying areas for restoration.
What kind of collaborative mechanisms make that happen?
They use things like rapid feedback loops, constant communication and data sharing between scientists monitoring reef health, the government agencies setting regulations, the tourism operators, the farmers impacting water quality upstream, and the traditional owner groups who observe subtle environmental shifts.
So it's adaptive, Learning by doing.
Highly adaptive, and the restoration efforts themselves are often transversal. Think about developing coral IVF technologies that inherently blends marine biology, reproductive science, engineering, logistics, all focused on one goal, helping the reef regenerate. It's science, policy, and community fused in action.
And this idea of crossing boundaries, collaborating for resilience, it's happening in the business world too.
Absolutely. The sources point to how companies are actively fostering interdependence in business at a regional level, partly driven by recent shocks like the pandemic and geopolitical instability.
You mean regionalizing supply chains?
Exactly. Moving away from hyper-globalized, potentially brittle supply chains. Companies are establishing more near-factory locations, regional hubs in places like North America, Europe, East Asia, to produce closer to their main markets.
Which reduces risk, makes them more resilient to global disruptions.
Precisely. It shortens the chain, builds in redundancy, reduces reliance on single-distance suppliers. It's a strategic move driven by risk mitigation, but it has the effect of strengthening regional economic ecosystems and interdependence. It reinforces that material foundation of Meta-SRG1.
Okay, and managing all this, the complexity, the different scales, the transversal collaboration, the need for rapid adaptation, it sounds almost overwhelming for human managers alone. This brings us to the final point, the role of AI in governance.
Yeah, the sheer complexity and speed required for effective 21st century governance, especially at regional scale integrating all these factors, seems to demand new tools. The sources highlight the rise of agentic AI and advanced large language models, LLMs.
Agentic AI, you mean AI systems that can take a high-level goal and then figure out and execute the complex steps needed to achieve it, coordinating across different systems.
Exactly. These aren't just chatbots. They are AI agents capable of performing complex multi-step tasks that require interacting with multiple, often separate enterprise or governmental databases and systems.
How does that help governance?
It can automate a lot of the coordination and analysis needed for transversal collaboration. Imagine an AI agent tasked with monitoring regional water quality. It could automatically pull data from environmental sensors, cross-reference it with agricultural land use patterns, check compliance with regulations, flag anomalies for human review, and even draft initial reports connecting different data streams.
So it enhances productivity, integrates information.
Significantly. The sources mention examples like integrated risk management banking, where AI can analyze data across many different departments and regions to spot emerging systemic risks far faster and more comprehensively than humans alone. This kind of technology could become the essential scaffolding for enabling the high-velocity, highly complex transversal governance this framework envisions.
Okay, wow. Let's try and synthesize this. It's a huge framework. We've journeyed through Meta-SRG1, where governance isn't just some neutral administrative task. It's presented as an active moral practice. It has to operate across time, deep past, present, long future. It's fundamentally relational, built on trust and interdependence. It's rooted in memory and culture. And it absolutely depends on breaking down silos, on transversal collaboration across every boundary imaginable.
That's a great summary. And if we boil down the key takeaways from Meta-SRG1 and those 6 supporting goals, maybe it comes down to 3 core principles. First, justice is foundational. Real sustainable progress needs more than just economic growth. It needs those guaranteed democratic rights, the political fail-safe against catastrophe, and it needs proactive work to reform those sticky social norms and structures that create inequality. That's SRG1 and SRG2. Equity is an add-on. It's central.
Okay, justice first.
Time is layered. Governance has to escape the short-term trap. It needs to institutionalize that long-horizon planning, the 5,100-year view, especially for things like infrastructure and climate, and back it with reliable, autonomous funding. But simultaneously, it has to formally recognize and integrate deep cultural memory, ancestral wisdom, as a living guide for action. That's SRG4 and SRG5. We need both foresight and hindsight.
Foresight and hindsight. Got it. And the third?
Third, resilience is relational. In our interconnected world, cohesion comes from actively managing the local fallout from global forces, like sharing the gains from trade and from genuinely integrating diverse ways of knowing, bringing indigenous knowledge, local experience, scientific data, economic analysis together across all scales, from the village to the region to the globe. That's SRG3 and SRG6. Resilience isn't about building walls, it's about strengthening connections.
Justice, time, resilience through relationships. Okay, Now, here's something that really struck me. The sources say governance isn't neutral. It shapes our worldview, and our worldview shapes it. And they use this term, suggesting that regionalization, done this way, is actually a practice of worlding.
Yeah, worlding. The idea that through these governance practices, through these collaborations and ethical commitments, we are actively co-creating our reality, co-creating meaning, values, shared futures in relationship with each other and with the planet at that crucial regional scale.
So, if sustainability, if building these resilient regions is fundamentally an ongoing dialogue, a process of worlding that needs constant learning, constant humility, here's the final thought for you to take away. What specific cultural narrative, what values, what ways of relating are you contributing to the co-creation, to the worlding of your own region? That's your deep dive.